Washington Journal continues.
Back at our table this morning, Jamie Raskin is Democrat of Maryland, sits on Judiciary and Oversight Committees, here to continue with us all this morning our conversation about the shooting yesterday in Virginia. Representative Steve Scalise, Republican of Louisiana, in critical condition. We're learning this morning from the hospital that the bullet tore through his body, breaking bones, injuring organs, and he's got a tough battle ahead. Congressman, what was your reaction when you heard what happened yesterday?
Well, shock, and everybody was terrified. And it was an extremely sobering, difficult day on Capitol Hill. It did bring everybody together. Most of us in Congress have kids. People's families were startled and terrified by it. And a lot of people are far away from their homes and from their families. But our prayers and our thoughts are with Steve Scalise and his whole family. And I thought that Speaker Ryan did a beautiful job of speaking for everybody when he said that an attack on one of us is an attack on all of us. We are a family in that sense. We all work in the same place together. It's hard to get to know people real well because it's so big. There are 435 of us in the House and 100 in the Senate, so there's 535 people. I think that is really, in some sense, the fundamental problem. There's just too many people to know everybody. But I was proud yesterday that two of my Republican colleagues came over to sit with me, Lloyd Smucker from Pennsylvania, and Clay Higgins from Louisiana, and we all sat together and spent a lot of time talking about what had happened. And so we have to figure out a way that we can have honest differences, even profound differences over things like healthcare, at the same time that we don't demonize, we don't vilify, and we certainly don't do anything to unintentionally activate people who are violently unstable in the country. So I think it was a moment of reckoning for everybody in Congress yesterday.
Did you attend the all-members briefing yesterday, and what did you learn?
I learned that seemingly everybody gets death threats. Everybody has experienced that, and it's a very stressful thing for people and their families. And there's been a dramatic coarsening of political dialogue and language. And of course, we see nonstop gun violence all over the country. I mean, yesterday, even while we were experiencing this trauma here in Washington and Alexandria, Virginia, there was another mass shooting in California, and I think this is something around the 150th mass shooting that we've experienced this year, and that's going up. The families from Newtown, Connecticut were in town yesterday to talk about what's being done to try to wrestle with the problem of gun violence. And one of the things I learned yesterday was that there is a conspiracy theorist, Alex Jones, who's been denying that the massacre that took place in Newtown, Connecticut at Sandy Hook even took place, which is just obscene, a kind of denialism that I think everybody across the political spectrum has to do whatever we can to reject and to repudiate. Because if we're in a political environment in which people deny basic facts and basic events, it gives license to people who are extremely unstable and who are inclined to violence. And we have to reject that across the political spectrum.
Do you spend some of your budget for your office on security?
No, not that I'm aware of. In my district office, because my predecessor, Chris Van Hollen, I think had some issues, we have pretty good security there. But I don't think that we spend money on security. And of course, one of the things that's great about American democracy is that people who go into public office remain accessible. I remain, very accessible because my district is right next door to D.C. I represent Montgomery County and Frederick County and Carroll County. And I try to be as open and accessible as possible. And, I think it would be unaffordable if all the members of Congress had security details the way that that Steve Scalise fortunately did have, because he's the majority whip rather. But I don't think we could afford it, and I think that we would lose something. And so, we need to do whatever we can to bring some common sense to gun policy, and to reestablish, those bonds of affection that Abraham Lincoln talked about. We are all Americans. We have to be patriotic in defense of our constitutional values.
Let's hear what our viewers have to say. David in North Carolina, a Republican. You're up first. Good morning.
Yes, I'm a Reagan and Abraham Lincoln Republican. And one thing that I'm concerned about is how in this society that we are basing everything that we do on legalism and militarism. We were fighting the longest war in history in Afghanistan. The veterans of Vietnam understand what it means to fight in an environment where you have turned the citizenry against you, and in that environment you can never win. So we need to turn away from a whole lot of legalizing weapons in North Carolina, getting ready to legalize weapons where you can carry a weapon at 16 years old. It is good to protect your own property, but it's very dangerous when you carry that mentality into the public atmosphere. Thank you very much.
Okay, David, Congressman.
So he made a lot of interesting points there, but one of them about militarism, and obviously, we're a country that didn't want to be involved in wars all of the time, but militarism can coarsen the civic sensibility. He also made a point about access to guns. We also have a culture of deeply rooted connection to guns in the sense that the Supreme Court said in the Heller decision, people do have a Second Amendment right to possess handguns for self-defense and do have a right to rifles for the purposes of hunting and recreation. But beyond that, it's regulable, and we have a long history of gun regulation too. Even in the so-called Wild West, there was a lot of gun regulation. There's an interesting book called Gunfight about how we have both a deep connection to gun culture, but also a real tradition and history of regulation of guns to make sure that it makes sense. And obviously, we continue to lose tens of thousands of people a year in homicides and mass shootings and suicides. And we have, I think, the most liberal gun laws on earth. And so we do see dramatic differences between the fatality rate in America and in European countries or Canada, for example. So I think he makes a good point about that. And I think we're going to have a lot of time to wrestle with that issue. We obviously don't want to inflame this current moment by getting right back into the gun policy debate. At the same time, we don't want to ignore the role that guns have. Obviously, if yesterday's shooter didn't have access to guns, it would have been a different kind of situation. And one thing I think everybody agrees with is that guns out of the hands of violently unstable people.
Let's go to Iowa. Brian, Independent.
Hello, good morning.
Morning.
When I heard about what happened yesterday, I called my mother, and I told her, I said, this is a horrible thing, and the sad thing about it is now this will be the catalyst, if you will, for, let's put it this way, it's an opportunity to finally look at ourselves and say, what should we do about this? And what bothered me was I believe that the pro-gun people, if you will, aren't going to see this as an opportunity to say, hey, maybe we should step away from this everybody should have guns sort of thing. And instead they're going to say this is why everyone should have guns. And the idea of everyone having a gun is just beyond insane. And then the idea of us and them, it's a horrible thing. We talk in terms of us and them, and then also the only person I ever heard, and I'm not saying the other candidates didn't mention poor people or the middle class or the lower middle class, but during the election, the only candidate I ever heard talk about the poor was Bernie Sanders, and he talked about the poor a lot. And I feel like the poor and the lower middle class and even the middle class are now just sort of, the pawns or the people that just don't matter. And, there's so many of us, and we're suffering terribly. I've been living way below the poverty line for 27 years, and it's not easy. And, people ask, well, why do people get angry and go postal and whatever? And it's because people are suffering terribly. And a lot of people say, oh, you're not suffering, you've got it better than somebody in a third world country who lives on a dirt, has a dirt floor and no electricity. Well, in America, we would like to have a certain standard of living, and when you can't achieve that and you're just struggling and you don't know if you're going to be able to keep your apartment because you can't pay your rent, or you just don't have enough money for food and you don't know what you're going to do, and then you see all the discourse in the political society and social society where everybody's at each other's throats, and it just is overwhelming. And I hate to, it's just overwhelming, and we have to talk about getting ourselves back to being civil and down to earth and open-minded, and less, we can't be narrow-minded about this entire thing, like more guns and more war and not caring about the poor. It's not going to work. It's not working.
Okay, Brian, I have to leave it there. Congressman.
Well, he makes some very powerful observations, and I want to thank you for your call. The first thing is that I think you speak for millions of people who not only feel they've been left behind in the economic recovery that we've had slowly and gently since the 2008 mortgage meltdown crisis, but who actually were left behind. There are lots of people who have not recovered yet, and that leaves a lot of people depressed and stressed out and anxious for themselves and their families. And I think that we need a politics where everybody actually is focused on what we can do to bring every American in to the economic recovery. And so we've got to be dealing with the question of job training and technical training and real affordable college education for everybody, and so on. So that point number one, I totally agree with. Number two is I am with you that I think we should not turn away from the problem of gun violence, of which this is now one more glaring and notorious and painful example. It's not even the first example of gun violence against members of Congress. Gabby Giffords, who ended up leaving Congress after the attacks in Arizona, continues to be a very strong voice for common ground, common sense proposals that the vast majority of American people agree with, including a universal background check so we don't have guns in the hands of the wrong people. And finally, he makes the point about the mental health crisis in the country. We know that there are millions of people who need medical treatment. And we have to make sure, as we deal with the debate over the Affordable Care Act and how to move forward and to get more people into the healthcare system, we've got to make sure that mental health is front and center. It's just as important as physical health, and we've got to deal with that. The only thing that I would take exception to is the use of the phrase going post. I know he meant it in a jocular, facetious way, but the millions of people who work at the post office, I think, would rightfully take exception to the use of that phrase. There are dramatic episodes of terrible gun violence that we've seen everywhere, from shopping malls to movie theaters to churches, where white supremacist Dylan Roof went in and assassinated 9 people in Charleston, South Carolina, not long ago. So we just got to deal with the problem of gun violence comprehensively, and I hope we can do that in a newly civil and respectful way, where people who are for gun safety regulation don't think that conservatives on the issue want to see violence. I think they don't, and I hope that conservatives on the issue don't think that liberals want to tear up the Bill of Rights and destroy people's constitutional rights, because they don't. And so we've got to find that common ground center.
Congressman, want to get your reaction while you're here with us. Congressman, want to get your reaction while you're here with us to the Washington Post story yesterday that the special counsel, Bob Mueller, is going to be talking with top intelligence officials in this administration, the NSA director, Admiral Rogers, DNI director Coates, Washington Post, others saying that this is proof that Bob Mueller is looking at obstruction of justice by the president. Mr. Trump tweeting out this morning, they made up a phony collusion with the Russian story, found 0 proof, so now they go for obstruction of justice on the phony story. Nice. He also said, you're witnessing the single greatest witch hunt in American political history, led by some very bad and conflicted people.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I don't think that we should accuse other people in the political process of being bad, or people in the legal process of being bad or evil or so. That's part of the problem of demonizing and vilifying people and accusing them of having false motives. So, look, that investigation is ongoing. I have no idea what's happening there, and there are rumors and leaks or imputations of leaks, and who knows what's really happening. Obviously, the president, because of his tweeting, left a kind of trail of breadcrumbs. He said, I'm getting rid of Comey, or I got rid of Comey because of the Russia investigation. So I think that in itself would lead any reasonable investigator to want to look into it, in addition to the former FBI director's own testimony about a very unusual, perhaps unprecedented series of overtures by the president. So let's let the investigation go where it will. I'm more concerned about the massive attack on American democracy by the highest levels of the Russian government and Vladimir Putin. I was pleased yesterday to see that the U.S. Senate passed on a vote of 97-2 sanctions against Russia. I think that is not in dispute. The whole question of collusion is in some sense an irrelevant distraction at this point, just from the reality that Russia had a plan to engage in cyber espionage and cyber sabotage of the American election, and broke in electronically to the DNC headquarters, the DCCC headquarters, John Podesta, and so on. And I'm glad that the Senate acted in a broad and bipartisan way to reject that yesterday. And I think that the House, I hope the House will follow suit and will take the same position. And the rest of it, let's let the law enforcement process, pursue its own course.
You're a graduate of Harvard University, Harvard Law School, constitutional professor for 25 years.
At American University.
At American University. What do you think about your role on Judiciary Committee and this being investigation by the intelligence committees?
Well, there are obviously components of it that really do come under the Intelligence Committee's jurisdiction, related to counterintelligence operations and what's taking place, in the world of cyber espionage and sabotage. But the Judiciary Committee has a very important role to play to make sure that the basic constitutional values of the country, separation of powers and civil liberties and civil rights, are being vindicated. And I also serve on the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform, and we also have an important watchdog role in making sure that public integrity is respected at every stage of the law enforcement process and in every stage of executive branch activity. I mean, the founders of the country believed in checks and balances because they knew that nobody was perfect. And so we've set up a system where we watch each other and we try to work together wherever we can to advance the common good.
Some of your colleagues have called for drafting of impeachment papers. Where are you on that debate?
Well, look, President Clinton was impeached, obviously, over, lying about an affair that he had with an intern, and the House brought the articles of impeachment. The Senate ended up rejecting it. And it's obviously the most solemn and serious responsibility we have in terms of dealing with the executive branch. I've not introduced articles of impeachment at this point in my life. I've never done that, but I'm studying very carefully the whole question of abuse of power and what's taking place in the government. And I think that the members of the Judiciary Committee, Republicans and Democrats both, take that responsibility very seriously. And some people thought that it was cavalier to do what the House of Representatives did with Bill Clinton. And that example, I think, weighs heavily on people's minds. People want to make sure that if it were ever to come to that, it would only be because of the most serious breaches of responsibility of the president and the most serious violations of the rules of the rule of law.
Let's go to Ingrid in Florida, Democrat.
Good morning, Representative Raskin. Good morning, C-SPAN.
Morning.
Representative Raskin, Greta read from the newspaper about a Republican, Duncan, I believe his name, wanting to do silencers on guns. I think that's terrible. It's scary. And I agree with some of the callers that had come in the last 5 minutes to you about the guns. I just think that our country has too many guns. And if you look at any other civilized country, they don't have guns. Police don't have guns. And I think we have to look at our country and say enough is enough. And this president seems to like a controversy. They always, the media is always saying how the president likes to have people in a turmoil. And I think that, we need to come together. And thank you for your coming on today. Thank you, C-SPAN.
Well, and thank you very much for your call. Let me first say on the silencers issue, I think that the terrible episode of violence that my colleagues experienced yesterday practicing baseball does suggest some of the problems with that bill, because it was the sound of the shots, which was recorded by somebody there. I remember hearing yesterday at a couple of different points on the radio the sound of those shots, but it was the sound of the shots that helped to alert the people practicing, as well as people in the neighborhood, that something. So I think that at least should give us pause about the legislation to make silencers more widely available. So I agree with you on that. And I think what we need is a whole new tenor and tone of conversation about the gun policy issue. We have gun regulations, we have gun laws. They've been passed, historically with the support of the National Rifle Association and other so-called pro-gun groups. And I think that we need to have a meaningful conversation that's not about finger pointing and blasting the other side, but what can we do to improve public safety consistent with the Second Amendment? The Supreme Court did us a big favor in the Heller decision, which comes right out of the District of Columbia, about a handgun ban here that was struck down by the Supreme Court in D.C., and it said that people really do have a right to possess handguns for self-defense and to have access to rifles for the purposes of hunting and recreational activity. But in Maryland, we banned military-style assault weapons. We banned high-capacity magazines, and the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals upheld that and said that's consistent with the Second Amendment. So we can find that common ground where we are respecting people's basic Second Amendment rights within our constitutional culture, and at the same time preventing the acquisition of egregious weaponry by people who shouldn't have it, and also making sure that the wrong people don't get any guns at all. And that's the universal background check legislation, which the last I saw had the support of more than 90% of the people. And that might be something that we could put on the table when we finally do resume a meaningful debate on the subject.
Go to Akron, Ohio. Justin, a Republican. You're on the air with Congressman Jamie Raskin of Maryland.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Well, first of all, gun control, it's typical for D.C. to start talking about gun control because you don't have a single policy suggestion that would have stopped what happened yesterday. But that's not why I called. I called because the real problem is Washington, D.C., and nothing could illustrate it more than the Washington Post yesterday, coming out with more nonsense about what's going on with Trump. You guys are amazing in your inability to run a balanced budget, your inability to run an investigation without leaks. The media that supports you is firing up people like crazy in this country. You are completely unhinged in Washington, D.C., and you're the problem in this country. You guys are not a solutions provider. You are the problem. And until you get your act together, this kind of thing's going to keep happening in this country. So stop with all the gun control nonsense. If you can tell us what your policy suggestion is to stop what happened yesterday, I'm sure we'd all love to hear it.
Justin,
but I don't think you got one.
Justin, just to be clear, though, for our viewers, are you justifying yesterday's actions?
Of course not. What are you talking about?
Well, just that you said more of this is going to happen unless members of Congress start acting in a different way out here.
That's right. Your behavior is encouraging people to do those things.
Okay.
Congressman? Okay. Well, I like you, I'm a bit baffled by the caller because, he seemed to be pointing the finger at me or perhaps the Washington Post or Democrats about not passing a balanced budget. Of course, the Republican Party is in control of the House and the Senate and the White House. So, if there's any legislative inaction that you want to decry, I'm afraid you've got to point your fingers at the hands of the majority, not the minority at this point. But I'm not interested in finger pointing. I'm looking for common ground solutions where we can move together. Now, if you're talking about gun policy, again, the universal background check is something that's supported by commanding numbers of the American people in every public. All that does is to say that everybody should be checked to make sure that they're not a felon, that they're not a violently unstable person, that they're not an undocumented person, people who are categorically ineligible to receive guns. And so that's something I think that would be a very common sense legislative step that people in public opinion polls of both parties and independents all say that they support. We can move forward on this. You know, I've got to say, I'm from Maryland, and I represent the great people of the 8th Congressional District, and I understand that there's a tradition in American politics of running against Washington, people who want to go to Washington, blast Washington, and so on. But what happened in Washington yesterday, it wasn't even Washington, it was in Alexandria, Virginia, also happened in California yesterday with the UPS shooting, and it happened in Arizona with Gabby Gifford. So I don't know that you can blame that on the Washington Post. There is gun violence that's taking place across the country. So I think that his is the voice of hopelessness and pessimism. And there are lots of good people in Washington, Republicans, Democrats, and some independents too, and Greens and Libertarians who are really struggling to come up with legislative proposals that make sense for the country.
Clyde in Sicklerville, New Jersey, Democrat.
Good morning. I'd like to say I'm sorry what happened yesterday. It changes my mind on the certain things and going on in this world today.
How so, Clyde? How so?
Well, the way things is happening, it's like yesterday, the shooting and one individual who decided to do this madness, and it changed his policy of certain things in this country. And just because one bad person did this, it doesn't give him the right to play God. If you don't like the person, don't vote for him. That's the way I look at it. And if it would happen if the Democratic and the Republican Party would play and this happened, it changed the whole course of history and life. And this is the American way. And I just don't think people has a right to play God. That's all I have to share. Thank you for letting me call.
I love that call. Thank you for calling in. You know, there are people in American history who have played God, as you say. The people who assassinated President Lincoln and President John F. Kennedy and Robert F. Kennedy and Dr. King. There has been a history of assassination where people try to substitute their own personal will for the general dynamics of political democracy. And it's an extremely dangerous thing. And we all have to try to make sure that we're engaged in a political culture in a way that does not wittingly or unwittingly activate the most violently unstable people in the country. We've got to watch our language, as a lot of people were saying on Capitol Hill. So I appreciate that a lot. We know that there is what historian Richard Hofstadter called a paranoid style in American politics, and we have to do whatever we can to diminish and quarantine the paranoid style rather than spread it, which is why I think that all of us, and especially the media, have a responsibility not to spread conspiracy theories throughout the body politic.
Well, Congressman Jamie Raskin, Democrat of Maryland, we appreciate the conversation with you this morning.
The pleasure's all mine. Thank you for doing it.